Thank you very much. I feel deeply honored to have been invited to give this lecture, and I thank the school for its warm and generous hospitality. For me, the story began on this title page and dedication in a book I saw on the reference shelf at Dumbarton Oaks, a Center for Byzantine Studies in Washington, D.C. Oop, it always happens. Okay. A lecturer in modern Greek at the University of St. Andrews and his patron, the third Marquess of Bute. Modern Greek in the 19th century at the oldest university in Scotland. This seemed remarkable to me, especially as it was certainly not taught there in the 20th century. But it was not until 10 years later, when I myself was teaching at the University of St. Andrews, that I began the search for Lord Bute and Antonios Yannaris, starting at the university's archives, where I found mention of the appointment. To learn about the people involved, however, I traveled to the Bute family home, Mount Stewart, on the Isle of Bute, off the west coast of Scotland, for Yannaris, to Chania, and Athens. And this is a map showing with red dots all the places that I did archival work. So starting here, then St. Andrews, then the Isle of Bute, and finally Crete and Athens. The story became more and more interesting and involved big names in Greek cultural and archaeological history: Dimitrios Vikelas, George Lambakis, John Gennadios. Most of what I am about to tell you is nowhere to be found in the two biographies of Lord Bute, nor in anything written about him. John Patrick Crichton Stewart, the third Marquess of Bute, was the heir to a fortune made in coal in Cardiff, Wales. In his relatively short life, he was born in 1847 and died in 1900 at the age of 53. This multimillionaire sponsored 60 building projects, was patron to a dozen architects. He was a traveler, archaeologist, linguist, theologian, historian, astrologer. The list of his interests and activities is long, but the most defining aspect of his life was his conversion to Catholicism at the age of 21. To say that most of Bute's pursuits, including his conversion, originated in his love of the medieval past would not be an exaggeration. It was said of the young Marquess that meeting him was like reading Lothair in the original, a reference to Disraeli's novel in which the hero exclaims, "I wish I had been born in the Middle Ages." It was the 13th century to which Bute was devoted. He regarded the Renaissance as a decadence and the 13th century as the highest intellectual and artistic point which the Western world has ever attained. I quote him. Bute's medievalism found visual expression in the many castles he restored and recreated, and in the chapels he built. Both he and the architects with whom he worked had an on-the-spot knowledge of medieval buildings. For Bute and his architects, archaeology went hand in hand with architecture. This can be seen from the way the same architects both built new buildings, basing their work on older models, and also restored the old and recreated it. At Castle Coch, near Cardiff, William Burgess turned a 13th century ruin, a heap of rubble, into a dream castle residence for Bute. He followed the original ground plan, but recreated the upper portions, the round towers capped with steep conical roofs, justifying his conjectures by reference to medieval manuscript illuminations. For the rebuilding of the family home, Mount Stewart, on the Isle of Bute, after a fire in 1877 destroyed the central block, Bute employed Roland Anderson, whom he sent to Aachen to study the railing surrounding the tomb of Charlemagne. Anderson recreated it in the Great Hall, all marble and stained glass. And there you see the railing here, the centerpiece of the new building. At House of Falkland in Fife, Scotland, Bute had the interior redecorated. He had a Corpus Christi procession painted in his bedroom. This summer feast day, introduced in the mid-13th century, was a celebration of the Eucharist by a procession. A wide frieze around the bedroom represents the assembly of candle-holding clergy and other notables, children strewing the path with rose petals, and Bute himself in a red gown. Bute's buildings in Scotland and Wales give ample evidence of his archaeological approach and close involvement with the Gothic, with buildings and subjects from medieval France, Italy, and Spain. His medievalism, expressed in his building activities, was very much a product of the times in which he lived. Given this deep attachment to the medieval West, one can wonder how it came about that Bute opened his eyes to the medieval East, to the Greek language, Byzantine churches, and archaeology. As we know, even today, those who are interested in the Western Middle Ages are not usually, and in fact are hardly ever, also interested in Byzantium, let alone modern Greek. How did it come about that Bute was? We can follow the development of Bute's interests through his travel diaries and his correspondence. At the age of 19, on his grand tour in 1866, before his conversion at the age of 21, Bute saw the sights in Istanbul. He first encountered Greek Orthodox worship there in the cathedral in Pera. The experience was decidedly disappointing. In his travel journal, he described the service. It lasted till 9:30 or so and was perhaps the most disagreeable function I ever assisted at. The church was crammed with people in a state of restlessness and irreverence, apparently peculiar to Phocians. In my opinion, the function was almost as much spoiled as slurring, drawling, irreverence, bad music, and bad taste could spoil it. On the same voyage, he expressed a negative view of icon veneration. Pictures exposed to receive an exaggerated homage unknown and undreamt of in the West. If his attitude to the Orthodox Church is not surprising for one about to convert to Catholicism, his feeling for ancient sites and Greek landscape is also to be expected of one educated in the classics. In 1877, on what appears to be his first visit to Athens, he sent to his wife Gwendolen a description which approaches ecstasy. We have all day been looking at the antiquities, the temple of Zeus Olympius and the theater of the Dionysus in the morning, the Theseum, the Pnyx, and the Acropolis in the afternoon, set in the midst of a lovely landscape, canonized, beatified, transfigured, vivified by the most exquisite poetry and history. They quite exceed anything at Rome. The pure Greek art is totally by itself, and I shall have to go again more than once before I can fix what it is first, and then try to conceive, which I suppose cannot be done, what it must have been. It is a dream of intellectual sensuality. One might conclude from this account of a man of 30 that, like so many other travelers to Greece of his time, he was not interested in anything after the classical period, be it the language, history, monuments, or people. Yet Bute's involvement with Greece became a total one. He did not stop with antiquity. He did not stop with the Middle Ages. He saw ancient, medieval, and modern Greek history and language as an integral whole. It is difficult to determine when his attitude changed, but already on the same journey of 1877, in which he described the antiquities as a dream of intellectual sensuality, he talks of visiting some very quaint small old churches in the small new town that Athens was. He also began to express a less harsh judgment of the Orthodox Church. On the whole, the state of the schismatic church is in favorable contrast to much one sees at Nice. He had left his wife in Nice, going by steamer for his first visit to the Greek mainland. Although then the 1877 visit to Greece shows signs of a change in attitude and approach, it is in the last 20 years of his life, from the 1880s until his death in 1900, that Bute's interest in and attachment to Byzantium, contemporary Greece, and Greeks is best documented and most marked. It is in these years that Bute studied Byzantine archaeological remains, took lessons in modern Greek, published essays on Byzantium, and built Byzantine. In 1884, in a long visit of many months in Greece, documented by his daily letters to his wife, Bute traveled around the Peloponnese, Zakynthos, and Patmos. Everywhere he studied classical and Byzantine remains. This he had done before, but not to the same extent and not in the company of Greeks. On this trip, he had in his traveling party the director of the library of the Greek Parliament, Panagiotis Kalogeropoulos, whom Bute called K in his letters. With him, he discussed Greek politics and the church. Kalogeropoulos also gave Greek lessons to Bute on this journey. They had much in common. Kalogeropoulos, who held a doctorate in philosophy, published essays on a wide variety of subjects, including Byzantine history and spiritualism, another of Bute's interests. On this journey, Bute's letters to Lady Bute give ample evidence of his interest in contemporary Greece. At Patras, he mentioned special prayers. There were prayers for fine weather, as they are in terror about their currents from the threatening thunderstorms. The currents seem to be drying in beds on the ground all over the country, and the color of these beds of drying black grapes is the most marvelous deep dead purple I think I have ever seen, especially when it is set off by the marvelous living green of the vines close to or through which one sees it. On Zakynthos, Kalogeropoulos' place of birth, Bute commented how the island is celebrated for its flowers, used to make cosmetics and scents, and the Zacynthians for their good manners. They are certainly very civil. Even the dogs don't fly at you. At Yithion, he remarked, the fashion of separating the women from the men in a gallery seems to prevail in all these new provincial churches. The gallery is rather the best place of the two. At Nafplion, the executioner of Greece and his guillotine are kept on a small fortified island in the harbor. He is a murderer himself, whose life has been spared on condition, etc. They say there have been 5 or 6 executions this year. These and many other observations testify to Bute's interest in all aspects of life in Greece. The Greece of this visit was also full of reminders of Byzantium for Bute. On Turkish Patmos, Bute noticed how the church kept the dream of the Byzantine revival alive. We went yesterday afternoon to see the Church of the Apocalypse. The priest and deacon sung a short office. At the beginning, I noticed, when they had prayed for the ecclesiastical authorities, that they prayed for the emperor, but made a pause after the title where his name should have come if there had been any emperor to pray for. Another reminder of Byzantium came in the Peloponnese at Mistras, on the south wall of the narthex of the church of the Pandanassa, where Bute took note of a remarkable full-length portrait of Constantine XIII, the last emperor of Byzantium. In his day, Constantine XI was called Constantine XIII. The features were striking and resemble his medals. A lamp burned before it. It was not until later in the century that Gabriel Millet published the inscription, which identifies the subject of the portrait as a local grandee of the 15th century, Manuel Laskaris Chadzikis. Bute's misidentification is, I believe, related to the distinctive hat in which Manuel Chadzikis is portrayed. Pisanello had cast medals of John VIII, the brother of Constantine XI, shown wearing the same kind of hat. He had observed John VIII in person at the time of the Council of Ferrara, Florence, in 1438-9, convened to discuss the union of the churches. John is shown in profile on the medal wearing the skiadion, headgear that emperors and members of their court alike wore. King George IV had donated the Pisanello medal in 1825 to the British Museum. Bute may have seen it there, but he remembered the emperor on the medal as Constantine and not John VIII. Greece in 1884 was an independent nation, barely 50 years old, in the process of creating an identity for itself. The Greek Middle Ages, Byzantium, had been passed over initially, while the classical ancestry of modern Greece was stressed, held to be the basis of European civilization by Western Europeans educated in the classics. By the 1880s and the time of Bute's involvement with Greece, Greek intellectuals as well as foreign scholars were presenting Byzantium as the link between ancient and modern, and were demonstrating continuity in historical and archaeological studies, as well as in editions of Byzantine texts. It is to these years that Alexander Paspati's study of the great palace of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople belongs, as well as editions of the epic romance of the Macrides and other vernacular Byzantine texts. On Bute's extended stay in Greece in 1884, he met also with other Greeks who had interests in Byzantine archaeology, history, and literature. In many of his letters to Lady Bute, he describes meetings with George Lambakis, who had studied theology in Athens and had recently returned from Germany, where he had obtained a doctorate with a dissertation on the subject of the Christian antiquities of Attica. Bute explored Byzantine churches in Athens with Lambakis, who was a passionate advocate for their preservation. Soon after returning to Athens from Germany in 1883, Lambakis published an article in the Greek newspaper Aeon on the state of our Christian antiquities, in which he spoke out against the defacement, disrepair, and destruction of the Byzantine monuments. He remarked that the mosaics at Daphne outside of Athens, although of a quality surpassing those of St. Mark's Venice, were not protected or appreciated, while the Venetians collected money from visitors to their monument. Lambakis concluded his article with a plea for the creation of a museum of Christian art. Bute's friendship and collaboration with Lambakis, whom he must have met in the early 1880s, are documented by a series of letters written between 84 and 90. Bute wrote to Lambakis in French, although he states in one letter that he had wanted to reply in Greek, but hesitated out of lack of confidence. The letters show collaboration of the two men in the studying of monuments and in their publication. Bute also gave financial support to Lambakis' archaeological work and to the newly established Christian Archaeological Society, becoming a founding member. Lambakis was its first general secretary. In Athens, Bute studied Byzantine churches in the company of Lambakis. In his letters to Lady Bute, Lord Bute mentions specifically churches in the Agora and the Stoa of Hadrian, the name by which Hadrian's library was then known. Excavations were about to begin in the Stoa of Hadrian, which had been used as a marketplace since Turkish times and had suffered a number of fires because of the crowded wooden structures in it. Nearby in the Agora, the Church of the 12 Apostles in particular interested Bute. He suggested that it might have been a baptistry and not a church. He remembered that the woman who had shown him around the church spoke of a subterranean crypt full of water. In August 1884, Bute sent Lambakis 1,000 francs for expenses which the excavations of the Church of the 12 Apostles will cost. It is not known what Lambakis' excavations revealed, or indeed if they ever took place. In the 1950s, archaeological investigations inside the building finally revealed the original plan. The subterranean area full of water was not a baptistry as Bute had surmised, but rather an ancient nymphaeon on whose ruins the church had been built. Before returning to England, Bute made other contributions, both to archaeology and to the people of Athens. He gave money to a hospital for abandoned babies, contributed £500 in subscription to the British School of Archaeology, and gave 7 bronze statues, copies of ancient statues that were in the museum in Naples, to the city of Athens to be displayed out of doors. He suggested ammonia, which used to look a little bear. Imagine a bear ammonia. The statues remained for 2 years in a customs depot. Today, 6 of his bronze statues adorn Syntagma. The next time you go walking there, look at them and thank Lord Bute. Upon his return to Britain, Bute wrote Some Christian Monuments of Athens, based on his investigations with Lambakis. In it, he called for a proper study of the few churches which still remained in Greece after King Otto's 1836 decree placed at the disposal of the Ministry of Public Worship every ruined church in Greece, however important historically or however precious artistically, as a mine for the building of new places of worship, the new University of Athens, etc. Lambakis had made a list for him. In Athens, 89 churches had been destroyed, 43 preserved, and 8 were in ruins. By the time Bute's article appeared in the Scottish Review the following year, 1885, some of the churches he had described that were in the Stoa of Hadrian, in particular the Megali Panagia, had been badly damaged in a fire. In Athens, he had commissioned the Swiss artist Émile Gilliéron to make watercolor copies of the paintings in the dome of the Megali Panagia. The artist had made his name working for Heinrich Schliemann and later with Arthur Evans at Knossos. Bute had also engaged Gilliéron to make watercolor drawings of the Parthenon wall paintings. Both sets of watercolors have disappeared. Bute's ideas about the importance of medieval monuments are summed up in a lecture to the committee of the British School of Archaeology at Athens, entitled On the Continuity of Greek Life. He made a plea that the perfection of the ancient monuments should not blind those who were in responsible positions to the value of later monuments, Venetian, Frankish, Turkish, as well as Byzantine, which not only, he said, always have an historic value, but also often an artistic one as well. Thus, like his Greek friends, but also independent of them, Bute strongly believed in the continuity of Greek culture from ancient to modern times. His financial assistance and his studies of Byzantine monuments helped to establish Greek Byzantine archaeology in Greece in its early years. Bute promoted medieval Greece in another way. In the 1880s, while traveling in the Mediterranean, he began a building project in Scotland, a Byzantine church. He sent Lady Bute a sketch plan from Italy in 1882. A few months later, he discussed the dedication with her. I quote, I had some idea of having it dedicated to the eternal wisdom of God, since it will be the first and possibly the only specimen in Scotland of the style of which the Sophia of Constantinople is the chief type. Bute was referring to Justinian's Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia. On his grand tour in 1866, he had caught sight of this church when approaching Constantinople on the deck of a paddle steamer. I quote, ahead was a great veil of silver mist shrouding all the waters, and far away rose over this 2 vast domes with minarets clustered round them, all gray and shadowy, like the domes in a mysterious picture I once saw, with no apparent foundation on earth. Domes remained a central concern and interest for Bute after this first, and it seems only visit to Constantinople. He wrote to Lady Bute asking her to oversee the building of a church and stating, "What I want is to locate my dome." The sketch he enclosed shows an inscribed cross in square with 5 domes, a Middle Byzantine church which bears no resemblance to the domed basilica that Hagia Sophia in Constantinople is. Roland Anderson was chosen as the architect. In 1882, Bute returned the plans for the church to his wife with the remark that these churches are, it is true, almost invariably on the plan of a fat cross inscribed in a square, as this is. The church was built at Galston, Ayrshire, in the west of Scotland, where the Catholic community was in need of a church. It was dedicated in 1886, opening its doors to a congregation of 400 people. St. Sophia's Galston, the first Byzantine revival building in Scotland, still serves the Catholic community of around 70 parishioners who are aware that Lord Bute was the patron, but know nothing of its background or significance. The church was built of brick, as requested by Bute, and is appropriate to a Middle Byzantine church exterior. Anderson substituted a spire for the hemispherical dome. Bute complimented him in the pretty spire, much better suited to our climate. The outside of the building contrasts in a striking manner with the interior and does not prepare the visitor for the effect of the plastered and undecorated plain white dome and walls. Although Bute's original sketch plan did not convey the style of which the Sophia of Constantinople is the chief type, the interior of the church that was built does. Bute's St. Sophia is the closest in spirit to Justinian's church of all the St. Sophias in Britain or anywhere in the world. Light streams into the nave from the 8 windows at the base of the dome. The whiteness of the walls and the height of the dome contribute to a feeling of vast space and a floating dome. Likewise, the windows on the north and south walls, as in Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, are arranged in a semicircular wall surface enclosed by an arch, a tympanon. Okay, there we are, Hagia Sophia. So you can see some kind of resemblance. A local newspaper commented, there is a massive grandeur about the building that is awe-inspiring. Today, it seems inconceivable that anyone, much less someone like Bute, who was so deeply interested and involved in Byzantine architecture, could think that Hagia Sophia Constantinople was a cross and square church. Yet, he had not visited the church since 1866, when he was 19 years old. Plans were not available, photographs were rare, and Letheby and Swainson's book on Hagia Sophia was not published until 1894. It is clear from his essay, Some Christian Monuments of Athens, which he published in 1885, that Bute associated the Byzantine with the dome. At the end of his life, and with an architect who knew Byzantine architecture very well, Bute built another Byzantine church. Robert Ware Schultz, a Scotsman, despite his looks here, who trained in Anderson's architectural practice, had studied churches in Greece and in 1888 to 89, together with Sidney Barnsley, made a study with drawings of the monastery church of St. Luke in Phokis. In the preface of the book, to the book that was finally published in 1901 by the British School at Athens, the authors thank the Marquess of Bute for his many kind suggestions in connection with the notes on the hagiology and other matters. The two men had gone in 88-89 to make a systematic study of the remains of Byzantine architecture throughout Greece and to collect a large amount of material in the shape of measured drawings of buildings, studies of ornament, mosaics, photographs, etc. This is a quote. Bute is among those listed in the preface as having made donations to the British school which enabled the two men to travel. These two architects' detailed plans, elevations, notebooks formed the core of the Byzantine Research Fund held here at the British School. Bute's diary and correspondence reveal that he was in touch with Schultz in London at St. John's Lodge, Regent's Park, where Schultz built two chapels for him. The one on the grounds of the property is known today only from a photograph. It is a half-buried chapel with only its dome exposed above ground. The chapel was demolished in 1916 when the lease on the property came to an end. The half-buried, or sunken chapel, as Schultz called it, has puzzled those who have tried to explain it. Yet, in Athens in 1884, during his stay of many months in Greece, Bute had seen and remarked on the domed ruins half above ground of the Megali Panagia. He wrote to Lady Bute, "We went through the bazaar which is completely burnt away. There is a sort of wilderness inside the walls of Hadrian's Stoa, with Lord Elgin's tower standing in the midst, gutted, beside the domed ruins half above ground of the united churches of the Megali Panagia and the Taxiarchis." Bute remarked that to enter the church one had to descend 7 steep steps because of the extraordinary amount of rubbish accumulated on the spot, making the floor of the church some 15 feet below the present level of the ground. The architects who worked for Bute and with him to create, recreate, or restore were provided with the opportunity to study buildings in situ, giving them a first-hand knowledge of materials, methods, and structures. The functionalist Anderson put a spire on St. Sophia Golston and used reinforced concrete in the dome of the church, whereas Schultz, the arts and crafts artisan, with a profound knowledge of Byzantine buildings, worked with a historically accurate style, method, and materials. Like Bute, Schultz believed in the continuity of Byzantine art and architecture and recorded post-Byzantine and modern remains in Greece, as well as Byzantine. With Schultz, Bute's Byzantinism found its best expression. Bute had located his dome, this time at St. John's Lodge. The sunken chapel was completed in the year Bute died. A third Greek friend whom Bute met in the 1880s, one who introduced Bute to historical and literary developments in contemporary Greece, was Dimitrios Vikelas. It was Vikelas that Bute had the longest lasting and most intense friendship. Vikelas had lived and worked in London as a merchant, later in Paris. He wrote short stories, a novel, and essays. He is best known in Greece for his promotion of the modern Olympic Games that took place in Athens in 1896. His name first appears in Bute's correspondence with reference to his novel, Loukis Laras, published in 1879. Immensely successful, it was translated into 12 languages. Bute was reading it out loud in Athens in 1884 as part of his Greek lesson with Kalogeropoulos. Bute's long friendship with Vikelas had several consequences for Bute's Byzantinism. He became the translator from French into English of Vikelas's essays on Byzantium. In his essays, Vikelas set out to show that Hellenism survived, albeit in a modified form, during the Byzantine period. He argued that Byzantium should be compared not with antiquity, but with its contemporaries. Although the rejection of the spoken language was to be regretted, Byzantium had earned the right to the recognition of the modern world by the preservation of Hellenism and the propagation of Christianity. The essays appeared in the Scottish Review and were reprinted in 1890 in 7 essays on Christian Greece. Bute's translations made available to a wider audience the work of Greek scholars striving to put Byzantium on the cultural map of Europe. They promoted in Britain the idea of Byzantium as a vital link in the Greek language and in Greek history. Vikelas' attitude towards the spoken language of the Middle Ages was in keeping with his own position on the Greek language as a writer. His Lectureship was written in a form of Greek which is appropriate to the speech of a merchant, such as Lukis. Likewise, Vikelas translated Shakespeare's plays into the 15-syllable verse form used since the 12th century for works in the vernacular. Bute, Vikelas' English translator, also considered Byzantium as a vital link in the Greek language. He put emphasis on the living Greek language, not only in his writing, but also in his actions. He learned to speak Greek. With the help of Kalogeropoulos, and with the help of Vikelas, he sought a young lady to, quote, Hellenize not only his daughter Margaret, but also her English governess. At the end of 6 months, Bute was pleased to report that Margaret's Greek had revived. When Bute was unanimously elected by the students at the University of St. Andrews as their rector in 1892, a tradition that is maintained to this day, he proposed Vikelas for an honorary degree. For his own installation as rector, he designed his gown and hood, modeled on a Benedictine monk's habit. 3 years later, he wrote to John Gennadios, former Greek minister in London and translator of Lectureship into English, to ask him to recommend someone for a lectureship in modern Greek. Gennadios had a high standing in the London Greek community. Bute explained to Gennadios that he had succeeded in getting Greek recognized as a modern language in the arts curriculum, but that he hoped it would be studied as an introduction to ancient Greek. The salary was £200 per annum, and Bute was to pay it from his pocket. Gennadios recommended Antonios Yannaris, who was appointed a few weeks later in 1896. Yannaris came from Western Crete and was the nephew of Michalis Yannaris, a well-known leader of the Cretan revolt against the Turks. He had been educated at his uncle's expense, first in Athens, then in Germany. After an involvement in a failed uprising against the Turks on Crete, Yannaris went to London, where he continued his research in the British Museum. By the time of his appointment at the age of 44, he had published a collection of Cretan folk songs, a study of the 16th century vernacular Cretan romance Erotokritos, and historical Greek grammar with which I began this lecture, and a number of dictionaries. Yannaris taught in the winter sessions from October to April and spent the summers in London or Crete. His correspondence with his uncle, which I read in Chania, is practically the only source of information for his life. He refers to his bad financial state. He had an American wife and 2 children, and to the cold, and I have to cite this verbatim. The cold is sometimes truly unbearable, especially the frozen mornings and the foggy days without light. Yannaris' opening lecture was described in a letter to Bute by the Catholic priest in St. Andrews, Father Angus. It lasted under 20 minutes and gave an outline of some objections to modern Greek or to the benefit of knowing it, but he said he would go into more detail in his lectures. I think he said that our Lord spoke modern Greek. I believe Roberts, the professor of theology, thinks our Lord spoke ancient Greek. However, if so, they must fight it out. The syllabus Yannaris taught and his examinations ranged from Byzantine vernacular poetry, Cretan vernacular poetry of the 16th century, and folk songs, as well as most recent prose works of contemporary Greeks, whose names are connected with the Byzantine revival in Greece, Zambellios, Paparigopoulos, Rangavis, while the English into Greek translations were from Scottish newspaper articles. In his first session, Yanneris had 16 students, most of whom were also taking Greek and Latin, which were then still compulsory subjects. The following year, however, they became alternative subjects, something that Bute had fought against. This change led to a sharp fall in the numbers of students taking ancient Greek. When ancient Greek was no longer compulsory, modern Greek also suffered. Yanneris's position was not secure, depending as it did on Bute's patronage. It seems that he did not have the support of the professor of Greek, Burnet. Yanneris's appointment came at an unfortunate time in Bute's life. In his last years, he suffered a series of strokes, and his premature death in 1900 spelled the end of Yanneris's position, for Bute left no instructions concerning the lectureship. The 5-year renewal of his appointment was to run out in 1903, but the fourth Marquess, Bute's son, had agreed to provide his salary for 1 more year. Yanneris resigned in the winter of 1903 and returned to Crete. It had been an experiment, but even well-wishers, such as Principal Donaldson, who believed in the continuity of the Greek language, and who had even written a modern Greek grammar for the use of classic students, felt that Bute's ideas were not fully realizable. In his university address for 1897, Donaldson can barely conceal his exasperation at Bute's attempts to impose his advanced ideas on the university. I think it is very far from likely that universities will ever make modern Greek, Spanish and Italian, Hebrew and Arabic compulsory subjects, or regard them as the most important acquisitions. The Lord Rector has voted for the appointment of a woman as lecturer in physiology for men as well as women. He probably thinks that the French lecturer should be a woman, and in fact that women might be elected to all the professorships, but the country is not prepared for this. Indeed, the country was not prepared for this. In the event, the initiative in modern Greek passed to England, where chairs were established in Byzantine and modern Greek studies at Oxford and London, and a readership in modern Greek at Cambridge in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Writing about the history of Byzantine and modern Greek studies some years ago, Anthony Breyer, founder of the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek at Birmingham, asked why the founders of the English chairs had included the word Byzantine along with modern Greek in naming them. He concluded that for them, it was merely because Byzantium lay in between classical and modern Greek studies, quote, more as an untoward fact of life than some sort of link, end of quote. At St. Andrews, Byzantine was not part of the title of the lectureship. Yet, because of Lord Bute, it was in Scotland that the connection was first made between Byzantium and modern Greece. Thank you very much.